Hi guys, this is Miss Yandell, and I am currently in my classroom at the Ollie Center. Nobody's in here but me and technically you. So we're going to cover the first movement in American literature today. If you haven't had a chance to go on the course help section and copy off a handout, go ahead and pause me now so you can copy that off. I think it just says movements in American literature, and if you'll go to the toolbar link, you'll see that under class helps. So I'm going to go ahead and pause here while you get those materials together. The first official movement in American literature is Puritanism, and that's what we're going to talk about in this session today, in this little mini lecture video. So Puritanism is an important time period. As you can see, that time period was from 1500 to 1660. 1550 is what they're saying in the American literature books to 1660. But one thing I want you to note is that literature did not begin in the Americas with the Puritans or the European influence. From this time period of the Puritanism, it's going to be European influenced. Prior to that, however, you have Native American literature. And if you haven't taken a course on that, you certainly might be interested in doing so. Much of the literature coming from the Native peoples was from their oral traditions. The beautiful thing is that many colleges and universities, you can take a course on Native American literature, and since then, many of the legends, many of the stories have been put into writing so that you can take a literature course on Native American literature. I would strongly suggest that. I think what's essential for me, though, when I write pre-Puritanism on my paper, do you guys see that? When I write pre-Puritanism, I think it's really essential to remember that the Europeans weren't the first people here, nor were they the first people who enjoyed music or stories, short stories, or any number of things that literature does. The Native peoples were already doing that for centuries. So I just want to say that. Now, from Puritanism on, what you'll see is a strong European influence in the writing because, after all, the Puritans did come from England. So when you look at your handout, don't be surprised to see when we say examples of authors from that time period, don't be surprised that many of those are European or British specifically because that influence transferred to the Americas when they came. Well, let's look at our handout together and see what it says about this first Puritan movement. If you'll take a look at your paper, one of the things that it says is that this is a movement, Puritanism is a movement that developed in England and spread to New England colonies in America. So here's that European influence that I was referring to. Then it talks about the Puritan movement being an outgrowth of Calvinism, which is it's a movement within the Christian movement, the Protestant movement. And right here, I would say, if you have had a discussion on this in Humanities too, then you know what we're talking about. Or if you have a background in biblical theology or biblical history, you'll understand what this means when we talk about Calvinists. One thing that's important to note is the Calvinists are the forefathers of the Puritans. So to understand what they believed and what they held to be true and important helps us understand this movement. There are a few things written here that will explain some of that. And one of the things I want to interject here before we go forward is all of this information comes from a book called The Handbook to Literature. So these are not my words. These are words taken from a source which explains the various movements in literature. All right, let's return to our notes. One of the things it says here is that the Calvinists believed that one of their major tenets was that God is an awesome God. I have placed the awesome in quotation marks because that terminology for them is not the same as our terminology that we use today. When they say God is an awesome God, it's not like, oh, God is totally awesome. Isn't he awesome? It's not that kind of awesome. It's awe-inspiring. There's a huge reverence and fear when it comes to God. And that fear can lend itself to paranoia and a trembling fear. So as we look at Puritanism now, you will often see stories that reflect this movement, stories that reflect this idea of being paranoid about one's spirituality or soul. As we reflect on this movement now, we hear a lot about hell and damnation. And one of the reasons why you'll hear that is, let's take a look again at the notes here, if you will. The Puritans and the Calvinists specifically were often associated and referred to as the joyless creed. Can you imagine that, living that kind of life? But what that means, the joyless creed, is that they live their lives very soberly. That's not always a negative thing, of course, and many benefits come to us. Many things in our society today are reflected by both the good and the not so good of this movement. We see these things today. And I do want to interject here that the reason why it's important to cover these movements is not only that we identify these movements in the readings that we do, but that we can see these things reflected in the world around us. If you've ever taken me before in any kind of class, what's essential for me is that you see this stuff and how it has impacted us today. How it impacts our relationships with other people and our understanding of one another. All of these things we see in people. When I get ready to talk about these movements, one of the things I tell students is, think about each one of these movements and determine if it's a reflection of you or anybody you know. Because there are many people around us today who hold some of these varying ideas. And the more we know about these movements, the more we understand one another. And also, the more we understand the literature that we're reading. All right, let's return to the notes then. The next thing it says, the joyless creed, is that they believed they were the elect of God. And this is where we get into some doctrine, church doctrine, that's still prevalent today. And there may be many of you who attend churches or congregations who believe in this sort of thing. Now, what comes to us from this period is they believe that only a certain few were going to heaven. And what comes from this time period is that they were a little paranoid about it. So there are only a certain number of people going to heaven, and nobody but God knows who they are. So if you can imagine living under that kind of an ideology, then one would worry. You would worry, am I saved? Am I one of the elect? So this becomes an issue. This becomes a subject of a bit of paranoia. And not only that, but, and we don't cover this part in this class, but if you get in my American Lit to Civil War, we do. But the Salem witch trials, that's all coming out of this paranoia, the fanaticism that can be ascribed to this movement as well. Not everybody was like this, but this Puritanistic movement is coming down from the Calvinists. Remember, if I haven't said so already, Calvinism is the forerunner or the father of the Puritans. The Calvinists were like, if you want to think of them as being the fathers of the Puritanists, that's a way of thinking. So it's important to think about, what did the Calvinists believe and how does that come down to us, and how do we see that reflected in this literature of this time or this movement, and how does it reflect in people around me. All right, let's go back over here. And another thing that I have included here is the title of a sermon by a man named Jonathan Edwards. I don't know if you've heard it before, but it's Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. In the sermon, famously, Jonathan Edwards depicts, there's a scene that he depicts in his sermon, that human beings are like spiders on the end of this thin web that God is holding. Underneath that, visually, is the flames of fire, like a campfire, and that's symbolizing hell. And in his sermon, he says that if we anger God, think about the title, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. If we anger him at all, then he will drop us into the flames of fire. So God, in this idea, this Calvinistic idea, God is not a merciful God at all. I mean, there's not a lot of mercy going around here in this idea. And And guys, you still see this in people today and the way people think about religion and God. And if you know Christians, it's very possible, if all of us, if not all of us, know Christians, there are Christians who still ascribe to this way of thinking and being. And again, this is not something that we say out of judgment. We say this because so we can understand one another and we can understand the writing and from whence it comes. I mean, if we read Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God today, if your minister came and presented Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God today, many people would be outraged. There would be some who would be like, yeah, amen, that's awesome. But many people would be like, that's not okay. They don't see God in the same way. And so these Puritans, it's essential when you're reading this literature to have an understanding of what we know to be true about the way they thought about God and how they thought about each other. All right, so let's go back to the notes, and it says here, early Puritans in England and America were not. Okay, so here's what they're telling us. In England and America, the early Puritanists were not some of these, did not have some of the attributes that we have come to ascribe to the Puritans or the Puritanistic movement. So let's go ahead and look at that, because this is being fair. It says early Puritans in England and America were not long-faced reformers. What does that mean? What is a long-faced reformer? Well, we're talking, long-faced is a frown or sad. I mean, if you are concerned constantly whether you are saved or damned, which we're going to talk about that here in just a minute, I mean, it's a sober way of existing. And these people were almost hypersensitive to whether or not they were saved, whether or not they were one of the elect. Let's go ahead and look at this again. They were not long-faced reformers originally. They were not necessarily teetotalers. What are teetotalers? Teetotalers are people who do not participate in drinking or dancing or any kind of amusement like that. And you, by the way, still see that in Christian circles. There are some camps that don't drink at all. That's teetotaler. That don't dance, that kind of frown on amusements of any sort because they believe that living an existence is a sober thing. All right, back to the notes. It says haters of arts and music. Originally,